Dear colleagues, dear friends, we are starting our next panel. As we have mentioned yesterday, in this multipolar world order 2.0, great power competition is happening in post-Soviet Eurasia. Here we have Russia as a traditional player, the US, EU, and also China for its Belt and Road Initiative. So today we will discuss several topics about this important region. And at first, I want to invite Professor Dr. Kerry Longhurst from Collegium Civitas, Poland. Please, the floor is yours.
I'm going to sit. I've got my computer. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for the invite, for letting me attend. It's been really interesting, and I was just saying that I'm from a European studies background, and I've entered a different paradigm, a really interesting paradigm over the last day or so, and I'm very thankful about that. You know, we tend to live in a European bubble, even in Poland where I live. But and it's good to, I think, step outside and see things from a different angle. Nevertheless, I don't agree with everything that everyone said so far. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly, because we've got a real mega panel in front of us, is really about some emerging research that I've been doing with some colleagues back in Poland and in Brussels as well. It looks at Georgia, so it doesn't look at Armenia, but I think obviously there are lots of comparisons between Georgia and Armenia, both very small countries, difficult neighborhoods, etc., interesting neighbors, however we want to describe them. So this is the kind of background to the work. So Georgia is a very interesting case study to look at this kind of post-Soviet Eurasian integration set of dynamics. I mentioned already it lives in a very difficult neighborhood. Georgia lost almost 20% of its territory to Russia after 2008. And of course, Georgia is very close by to the war in Ukraine as well. All of these kind of more negative sides, but at the same time, Georgia over the last year or two has become much more important, as you know, in terms of connectivity, whether it's trade, whether it's energy, whether it's ideas, whether it's culture. Georgia is moving up in importance in that way. But at the same time, and this is what we look at from a European perspective, is that this is all very good, but what about the domestic context of a country? You know, Georgia is sliding backwards, most definitely, from democracy and the rule of law into something more autocratic, let's say, and a rejection of what we would call European norms. So these are just the reasons why Georgia is an interesting case study. And I think Georgia is interesting because of the similarities with Armenia, but the innate differences as well. So, but that's to explain why I'm looking at Georgia. So what's the situation? How has Georgia tried to deal with this testing, difficult, challenging geopolitical context? Well, I think very much like Armenia, as I've learned over the last day or so, Georgia has pursued this multi-vector, or more specifically, a tri-vector foreign policy. Obviously the European Union, obviously Russia, and obviously China as well. And this, of course, is the same or very similar to all small states, especially those in kind of transitioning regions. So we know that the tri-vector approach is the norm. However, what we are positing in our research is this is all very well and good, but recent developments, and specifically Georgia's invitation to join the European Union, is really going to upset this balance. And arguably, it's not going to be easy, indeed possible, for Georgia and maybe Armenia in the future, let's see, to pursue this tri-vector approach, because as we know, China, Russia, and the European Union, plus others, are systemic rivals. I've heard this word here, and I like it, and I think it's very, very appropriate to comparing Georgia, Russia, and the European Union in Georgia and this region. So what we're doing in our research is exploring this question as to why isn't this tri-vectoral approach possible, and why is it, you know, what are the challenges to it? Well, being a kind of IR scholar, is my claim, I'm interested in ideas to do with norms and values. And our argument is that as well as having physical, geopolitical interests, energy, ideas, transportation, the three powers from the outside, China, Russia, and the European Union, have very different normative frameworks, arguably different values, underpinning their approaches to to Georgia in particular in my case. So we're predicting, if you like, or forecasting or thinking about a systemic clash, a normative collision, a normative clash rather between the three external powers, with the kind of template or the stage being Georgia in this case. So very briefly, and I know that I'm going to be skirting over lots of different issues, I wanted just to kind of outline as we see it, what are the different norms and perspectives underpinning Russian, Chinese and European Union approaches to Georgia, and why this is going to bring about a normative collision. Well, and what makes them different rather than what makes them similar? Well, I think first and foremost, Europe is interested in European integration. You know, Europe has this view to see Georgia become sooner rather than later, hopefully, an actual full member of the EU. Europe is obviously interested as part of this in terms of transforming the domestic makeup, the governance system of Georgia. The EU is about trying to install the rule of law according to the way in which we see the rule of law. It's all about creating an open liberal market economy in line with EU norms and laws and directives. But I think crucially, what also marks Europe out in terms of its perspective towards Georgia is that Europe continues to recognize Georgia within its internationally recognized borders. And I think that differentiates Europe from the other external partners. So basically, through lots of different policies and European investment, normatively as well as economically, Europe is very deeply locked in to Georgia. Now, please correct me afterwards if I've missed anything out. And again, I'm just skirting over how we see the Chinese normative approach to Georgia as being. From our perspective, we see a big emphasis upon trade and connectivity. That's obviously not controversial at all. As far as we see it, I mean, there's a lot of cultural exchange, scientific exchange, educational exchange. I know that China is really fond of being a soft power, and this through the Confucius Institutes is very much present in Georgia. It's very strong there. And I know that China as well, I think, is becoming Georgia's third trading partner. But again, where China differs to the European Union, again, as far as I understand, is that China is not interested in transforming the conflict within Georgia. Obviously, China is not interested in getting rid of the oligarchs, is not interested in democratization, obviously, and also it's not interested in transforming the South Ossetia and Abkhazia territorial conflicts. There's a big difference. Meanwhile, Russia, again, a very different perspective towards this small country. What can I say? But what's interesting is that Russia has two faces towards Georgia, I would say. One is a paradigm of punishment. We saw that already back in the mid-2000s. And of course, Russia is not interested in Georgia having its own sovereignty and statehood, nationhood, and identity. But at the same time, what we have seen over the past 10 years or so is that despite this punishment paradigm of Russia towards Georgia, we also see the Georgian authorities, the Georgian Dream, the government, trying to seek a kind of cozy, stay in the bed type situation with the Russian authorities, which in my understanding is a big difference to the vast majority of civil society in Georgia. So that's kind of an interesting to keep in mind. Nevertheless, there's a lot of pragmatic cooperation still with Russia. There are direct flights between Tbilisi and Moscow, which again was very controversial on a domestic level. But Russia is also important from a trade point of view. Russia remains Georgia's second trade partner. So again, this is my very kind of brief overview. I know the situation with regards to those countries is much more nuanced and controversial and debatable, but nevertheless, I think we can agree that the normative underpinnings of the three external powers towards Georgia are very contrasting amongst each other. So what our research is going to be, am I good for time, by the way? Yeah. So what our research is going to be looking at, given that this is a very evolving situation, is that we've identified November the 8th, so very specific, as being a critical juncture in Georgia's attempts to maintain this trivectoral foreign policy. November the 8th sounds both bizarre, but it is very specific. But this was the date on which the European Union decided to give Georgia the official status of an EU candidate country. And of course, that does not mean that overnight Georgia's going to become a member. It's not. It's the beginning of what could be a very long process. Nevertheless, it means that Georgia is at the starting block, and it is fulfilling one of the core elements of its constitution, namely to Europeanize and to become a member of the EU. And this potentially, in my view, definitely will upset this balance in this trivectoral approach. What will the EU and Georgia be doing over the course of the next months and years, but arguably maybe just months, because the war in Ukraine puts a big emphasis on the need for an accelerated or an expedited enlargement process. So basically what's going to happen, Georgian authorities, EU authorities are going to get together over a table, as you know, and talk about ways in which they can structurally reform the Georgian economy, the Georgian political system, get rid of the oligarchs, install the rule of law, create a more open accountability system, bring in civil society into the governance process, etc., all the kind of standard EU ideas, which I know are double standard a lot of the time, but nevertheless. So this is what's going to be going on, and it's going to be going on very, very quickly. This EUization, this Europeanization of Georgia towards the EU is going to accelerate right now. So the point is that this is going to shake up to some degree, a lesser or greater extent, Georgia's typical trivectoral approach. How do I see that evolving over time? Well, I think it's difficult to say, but for sure there's going to be some impacts. I think the first point is that, given that joining the European Union is part of the Georgian constitution, the government, even though it is skeptical, even though it's friendly with Hungary, even though it pursues relations with Russia, civil society is strongly behind this drive to join the European Union. And Georgian civil society is very feisty and is very strong and very vociferous and very brave. And I think that they're going to really hold their government to account to move towards the EU sooner rather than later. How is Russia going to respond, retaliate to this? I think recent trends show us that we can expect some kind of retaliation, strong response. What's that going to be? Well, this is difficult to say, but recent trends might suggest some territorial actions, some territorial further annexation or consolidating Abkhazia and South Ossetia, a kind of full annexation of these territories. I've heard already about the idea of a new Russian naval port off the coast of Abkhazia, which would be just above Georgia's Black Sea coast. Finally, and I think this is maybe a nice way to end because it's a little bit more pleasant, is that how is China going to respond to Georgia becoming a member of the EU? I don't think that it's totally incompatible. I don't see that, which I think is really interesting. It goes back to the point, I don't know who said it, but it really stuck in my mind yesterday about frenemies, that there's a kind of level of toleration between China and the EU, accommodatory, that can somehow be worked out. And I'd imagine as well that Georgia being a full member of the EU single market would be also advantageous for the Chinese economic interests too. And of course, interconnectivity in the Middle Corridor. This is very much where China and the European Union, as far as I understand it, can see eye to eye. Maybe one little thing just to say at the very end, I don't know what the state of play is, but I know the plans for the deep seaport in Anaklia, is the tenders are still going through. And I think it's going to be interesting whether there might be a slippery kind of preference, let's say, towards a European consortium as opposed to a Chinese consortium, or maybe a Chinese-European consortium. This might be the start of something friendly. So, like I said, I've got maybe 1 minute now. This is just the start of the research. It's kind of ongoing, not least because Georgia's EU candidate status has only just been awarded. I'm really interested in what you might think about my reading of Russia vis-a-vis Georgia, my reading of China vis-a-vis Georgia, and I'm going to pass on because there's many people still to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But everyone have 15 minutes. Everyone is speaking. We are not making any kind of. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And next, I want to invite Assistant Professor Dr. Jessica Neyfi from Nazarbayev University to have a speech, please. The floor is yours. We will have speeches after we will collect questions and go forward, please.
The receiving end. So this has been a series of research projects that we're working on that look at social media. So going back and getting a sort of time analysis over the last 10 years of what the sort of development of public attitudes have looked like, and a series of surveys that have been done over the last 3 years that look at how are perceptions being seen now. And this matters, not only giving us indicators of how people have been feeling about Chinese investment, but also for Chinese future investments here, not just the big companies, not just their relationship with elites, but also their relationships with individuals. What it's going to be like for companies that want to seek partnerships with local Kazakhstani companies, especially when we're talking about the digital age, where we're looking at smaller companies and individuals who really can work more closely. And what do they want to work with? Who do they want to get investment with? And how does China's soft power and foreign policy and public opinion play into all of this? Because as we know, that the BRI is a product of inclusion. It's a product of cooperation. It's people-to-people connection that emphasizes shared futures and cooperation. However, China's had to contend with the rising negative perceptions alongside their increasing international presence. And so there's been a large discussion about the power of discourse. And so the world's flow of discourse vitally affects the prospects for survival of our nation and civilization. And that's a quote from a Chinese scholar that specifically looks at how China is being perceived internationally and how that's going to affect China's continued growth and development. And according to Wang Yiwei, soft power is regarded as one of China's highest level strategic concerns. And soft power as a concept is problematic because it intrinsically privileges the West. So part of this also starts to look at some of those perspectives as well. So we're going to look at some of the strategic narratives that have been incorporated as part of China's soft power, but also look at alternative perspectives. So where is the economic threat and security threat perspectives also playing a role? And so this also gets at that idea that China still has a possible weak discursive power, but where can they benefit? Where can they find space to sort of promote the discourse and strategic narratives that they're interested in? So the research in Central Asia largely so far has found public opinion that leans towards anti-Chinese and over time has become more xenophobic. And so we are interested in the idea of China's perceptions abroad could influence their long-term foreign policy plans, and a better understanding of what influences positive perceptions as well as negative perceptions is important not only for China, but for the local governments that fear public outcry from their bilateral relations. So some of the different areas that are largely seen across the literature to influence public opinion of China, we have the media. This is a quote from Birkenoff and Chen's piece, where they actually look at Kazakh and Russian media influences, and they define xenophobia in the media as the display of negative and stereotypical images of China and its people is pervasive, demonstrating strong fear and antagonism. They find that Kazakh media, particularly in Kazakhstan, tends to be more negative than Russian media. So the different language sources actually have an effect on the perceptions of China. And as well as identity and culture, which we actually explore a bit more, is to find out where identity and culture play a role. Largely, it's been seen as the China and the Chinese people seen as other and separate, not as similar and interdependent. Some of this actually dates back for this after independence, where the Kazakhs and Central Asia in general sort of had to develop at the end of the Soviet period their own identity and their own history. And that actually plays into our perspectives and our research, as well as the economics and market relations. So gains in market and potential access to Chinese markets sort of provide this positive aspect, but negative aspects are they feel like access, so the bilateral access, they have access to the local markets, but the local businesses don't necessarily have access to the Chinese markets. So locals are not benefiting from investment. Their opinions might become more negative over time. So where is the elite versus individual interaction going on and who's benefiting? As well as personal interactions. And that's actually going to be an ongoing part of our research because thanks to the new visa regime, for the first time, many Kazakhs who have their only interaction with China and Chinese companies are the names of Huawei when they buy a phone, or the interaction of knowing that there are Chinese companies and their perspective of, you know, they're separate, they don't come and visit our towns and things like that. And so this is a pervasive opinion that we're interested to see as they'll actually have interactions with the Chinese who are going to actually be able to visit now with the new visa-free regime. So our research study is in Kazakhstan. Of course, Kazakhstan is a huge receiver of Chinese investment, over 23.2 billion now since 2005. At the elite level, the political discourse between Kazakhstan and China is primarily characterized by diplomatic language, mutual respect, and a focus on cooperation and partnership. At the non-elite level, we find that studies found distrust of China and prejudice towards Chinese involvement in Kazakhstan. So our research agenda is to understand this public opinion and sentiment. How has sentiment changed over time? What are the strategic discourses being used through soft power and through, these are digital, largely digital discourses, but also media discourses as well. And so we have a couple different questions we're looking at. One, if Kazakhstani citizens believe that the Silk Road is an important part of Kazakhstan's history and identity, does it give them a more positive opinion of the current investment projects associated with the BRI? And second, the role of security and economic threat perceptions and Chinese sentiment in Kazakhstan. So today I'm going to talk through 3 different projects we're working on. First, our social media analysis, just giving a brief overview of sort of a chance to look at Kazakh Twitter specifically, largely because it is a unique group and a unique language group, so that it's very easy to pull Kazakh Twitter, well, X now, and you look at social media sentiment. It also gives us a chance to look at past perspectives where there's not a lot of historic data and surveys that go back 10 years to 2011. So we're getting a chance to at least look at how perspectives were changing, what was influencing what people were saying, and on a platform in which people were pretty okay with being able to voice their opinion anonymously. It's also the 4th most popular social media platform in Kazakhstan behind Pinterest, Facebook, and YouTube. And given the fact that Meta doesn't allow access to their data, Twitter was the next best for expression of attitudes. Then we also look at 2 survey-related research projects. One, our survey experiment, we're looking at how concerns about the rise of China, economic versus security, affect public attitudes towards foreign direct investment, and survey analysis looking at identity and culture in strategic discourse. So a bit of background that doesn't really turn out very well on these PowerPoints, but with sort of an overview of our most recent survey results and getting a background of what seems to have an effect. This is pre any treatment effects or anything, and sort of following along with some of the existing research that's been found is that we find that there are ethnic differences in perceptions, particularly between Kazakhs and Russians. This is, again, also reflected in media language. So those who are more reliant on the Kazakh media for their source of news tend to be more negative about Chinese investment than those who read the Russian media or who read simultaneously both Russian and Kazakh media. We also, unsurprisingly, due to a lot of the research and perceptions, the Islamic populations also tend to be more negative in comparison to Christian or atheist or agnostic groups or any other religions. And this is a bit of comparison from our surveys across China, Russia, and the USA. These were, of course, more recent surveys done since 2022. So Russia historically ranked a little bit higher in terms of being encouraged, but in more recent times, you can see a lot more negative sentiment towards Russia. As you can see, discourage a lot is dominated by Russian, but in these, China is second. And so overall, while on average, they median all sit sort of towards the neutral area, you see that the US tends to be encouraged more than either China or Russia in our survey group. And this is a survey of over 2,000 Kazakhs throughout the entirety of the country. So a brief look at our survey analysis, which comes from this idea that, is there historic changes going on? Are we actually seeing a rise of negative attitudes? So we have smaller surveys that had been done over time. This is actually a group of surveys that have been compiled together that are claiming that there's more negative sentiment. So we're like, do we see that actually in our Twitter response and what people are actually saying? And so we did a text, we scrubbed for text data from Twitter, we coded it by sentiment, and we've done some theme selection and text analysis, though I'm just going to go briefly over some of our key findings today and then move on. In total, this is 10,667 posts from just individuals. This is not media. We removed all media posts. We removed all government posts. It also removed all duplicate posts from a single user. So if a user posted something multiple times, it is not in this. Overall, it's 3,635 unique users throughout this period. So some of the key things that we found when looking at this is that we see a lot more positive towards the beginning of Kazakh use of Twitter, with a lot of especially economic driven. Economic tends to be a trend, but it has both a positive and negative. In the early years in 2011, we see a lot of China strongly supports the prosperity of Kazakhstan. It's, our government is working with China and it's going to raise our economic development. However, in 2013 to 2016, we start to see more negative sentiment, a lot of nationalism, especially related to the economy, but in other areas as well. So we see a lot of, Chinese workers make more than Kazakh workers. We see the land issue starts to come into play in 2013 with our land, in comparison to what's going on to Tajikistan. And that, they talk about China stealing their women. That actually is a trend that continues even with our surveys. People were still talking about and there was a whole thing about it because there was about sometime in this period, there was also dating sites that were helping Chinese businessmen come to Kazakhstan and find wives. And this did not go over very well. And so it is a constant theme that comes up over and over again. And again, we start to see a bit of positiveness in the period between 2000 and 2018, some culture and economic ties. Big part of this is Dimash. He's a big cultural singer in Kazakhstan, but he became very famous in China. And so everybody loved that he was famous in China. China was embracing Kazakh culture, and that was a big deal for them. But however, after 2019, you have a growth in negative posts, and it's avoiding Chinese goods. Chinese are exploiting our Kazakh relatives. So the sentiment on Xinjiang starts to show up a lot in the narrative at this time. And again, going back to the land, Kazakhstan may be occupied by China. The Chinese then marry Kazakh women, and Russia no longer protects Kazakhstan. So there's also the challenge of Russia versus Kazakhstan. And again, very negative at this time, starts to really also increase, like you see a lot of Russia, they're posting of Russia versus Kazakhstan versus China in a lot of Kazakh posts. Briefly look, I went over the different sentiments, but on the two different surveys we looked at, our first is our experimental survey methods on looking at security threat perceptions versus economic threat perceptions. So taking what we learned from the Twitter posts and actually asking people and finding out. And what we find is less so against the control of just a neutral statement about China. We find that economic particularly is reinforced in our surveys, that we're finding evidence to suggest that the economic narratives are much more important. And that they find the economic threat much more relevant than the security threat. They're not as concerned with the security threat. And briefly also on the New Silk Road, and this is more on the positive, it's a big part of reimagining the past in Kazakhstan. It's part of their national identity. And since independence has been the thing that linked a country that doesn't have a historical identity together. And as part of that, we find evidence in our questions to suggest that that belief that the Silk Road is part of Kazakhstan's history and identity, and its use as a strategic narrative by the Chinese is actually having a positive effect on their views of the Belt and Road and on their views of China's influence and digital investment in Kazakhstan. So it's really quite interesting to find about our conclusions, because the importance of discourse is really prevalent here, and that it's dealing with the historical and cultural linkages matter. And while it doesn't overcome the issues of othering, of stereotypes, it is a big deal and can help China in terms of their soft power in reforming digital discourses and thinking about how strategic narratives are being used. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I want to invite Associate Professor Dr. Jin Si from Renmin University of China, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. And it's a great pleasure and a privilege really to be here among these outstanding researchers and scholars and educators. I just want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude for the entire crew of the council, and also for your hospitality. And without your efforts, this event won't be possible. And with your permission, I would like to give my presentation with the title of Perceptions of Chinese Scholars on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So first of all, I would like to introduce the background of this study, and also the the significance of this study, and mainly the purpose of the research is to provide a comprehensive and systematic review of the existing literature written by Chinese scholars on the so-called Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And secondly, I'll provide an overview of the general features of the existing literature and the main themes and subtopics of the literature under investigation. And then I'll present the main findings of the arguments of Chinese scholars on each subtopic. And finally, I'll have brief discussion of these findings and briefly talk about to identify the research gaps and the underexplored areas, and also talk about the weakness or the limitations of this research and what can be done for future studies. And one reason to conduct this kind of research is obviously the outbreak of the so-called Ukrainian crisis in 2014, namely the annexation of Crimea Peninsula by Russia and the armed conflicts in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. And the latest escalation of this conflict in 2022. And you all know the story, so I won't spend time to explain the details. But what worth mentioning here is that in Chinese narratives, the term the Ukrainian crisis usually refer to this crisis that occurred in 2014, and the term Russian-Ukrainian conflict usually refers to this new escalation of the conflict. And it is interesting to point out that the term invasion that can be frequently found in Western media or news reports rarely appear in Chinese interpretations of this conflict. And this series of events provoked the increased research interest among Chinese scholars, which are represented by the journal articles published since 2014. So you can see there are two peaks in this chart, the one in 2014 and the other in 2021, which confirm with the occurrence of the two crises. And can see that after the latest escalation of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, there's surge of the academic interest on this topic. And for a decade, there are constant and persistent academic attention or efforts diverted to this conflict. And also there have been intensified academic discussions about this Ukrainian crisis and the Russian-Ukrainian conflicts from among Chinese scholars from various research institutions, think tanks, and universities. And here, just to name a few, you can see that the area cast of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences held a seminar titled "The Prospect of Ukrainian Crisis and Its Impact on Big Power Relations." And most of the seminars and academic conferences took place in 2014 to 2015, or in 2023 this year. For instance, the School of Global and Area Studies of our university, Renmin University of China, just held an academic seminar about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict this October. And the purpose of conducting this kind of research, obviously, is to provide an up-to-date and systematic review of the existing literature, to point out the consensus so far among Chinese scholars and the discrepancies, and also the research gap and the under-investigated areas, so that it might shed light on future studies on this topic or similar topics. And then I will give an overview of the literature under investigation. But first of all, I would like to explain the research scope of the study. So instead of covering all the academic journal articles, this study merely focused on the so-called CES-SCI papers. So the sample of the study comes from the collection of the CNKI. And these papers are the CSCI journal articles that have been primarily written by Chinese scholars and published since 2014. So you can see that in the trend line here is parallel to the previous one, but there's a slight difference. The slight difference is the two peaks. So instead of having the first peak in 2014, in the CSCI papers published has its first peak in 2015, and then the second, or the highest, the second peak in 2023. And considering the time lag of getting your papers published in CSI papers, and this is understandable. So the literature under the investigation can mainly be categorized into 3 C groups. So causes, course of the crisis or conflict, and the consequences. A majority of the literature tend to discuss the consequences and implications of this Russian-Ukrainian conflict on either the landscape of international relations or big power relations, or the consequences on world economy and international trade. Other topics include food security and energy, international energy development and cooperation. And this cluster chart shows the subtopics, the number of the published CSCI papers by subtopics. You can see the main subtopics include what I just mentioned: food security, world economy, global energy cooperation, and Russia's foreign policy, or the transformation of Russia's foreign policy, the so-called turning to East policy or strategy after the eruption of the Ukrainian crisis. And from this chart, you can witness that a majority of the literature tend to discuss the implications and the consequences for big power relations, such as the bilateral relationship between Russia and the United States, or the bilateral relationship between China and Russia, or the relationship between Russia and Europe. So here comes the main findings of this research. So the main arguments of Chinese scholars on these subtopics. So when it comes to the causes or the deep roots of this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, the question about the causes of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is the question of whom to blame, or who should be held primarily responsible for this conflict. And Chinese scholars, the opinions of Chinese scholars are divided on this research problem. So you can either blame Russia or blame the West, and mainly the United States, NATO, and the EU, or you can blame Ukraine. Well, for some Chinese scholars, the major motives of Russia's special military operation, since we try to avoid using the term of invasion. So usually when this is discussed in Chinese narratives, we use the term special military operation. So the motives for Russia's military operation is mainly out of the security concerns, economic interests, or geopolitical and territorial expansion, and finally this cultural and ethnic identities. Some Chinese scholars tend to blame the West, and their arguments are quite similar to some of the American scholars, such as John Mearsheimer. So they believe that it was a mistake for the NATO to promise that Ukraine and Georgia to the possibility of joining NATO. I mean, Russia or Vladimir Putin swallowed the first expansions of the EU and the first two expansions of NATO. And Ukraine is where he drew the line. Ukraine to Russia is quite similar to Cuba to United States. So this is the bottom line. And Putin made it quite clear in the G8 summit just before the eruption of the crisis that Russia cannot accept the fact that Ukraine, the possibility of Ukraine's joining of NATO. So it is the recklessness of NATO and the United States that have caused this conflict. And finally, a small bunch of Chinese scholars argue that it was the mistake of Ukraine's foreign policy. I mean, it is kind of cruel to blame the Ukrainians for this conflict, since they are suffering. And that some Chinese scholars argue that it was this double dealing of the Ukrainian government in double dealing from policy of Ukrainian government and the reckless intention of joining NATO that have caused this conflict. And when it comes to the development of Russian-Ukrainian conflict, most Chinese scholars tend to describe or introduce the progress and process of the Crimea crisis or the armed conflicts in the eastern Ukraine. And some scholars analyzed the effect of the so-called Normandy format. And the basic argument is that the Normandy group talks have not been effective, despite the fact that some of the talks did contribute to the signing of two Minsk agreements, and to some extent, the ease of the tension in eastern Ukraine and the mutual exchange of detainees. an issue about the essence of this war, of this conflict. And most Chinese scholars believe that this is a kind of new war, it's a so-called hybrid war, which blends the conventional war and the irregular war. And multiple tools can be used in this kind of new war, such as media and cyber attacks, or information and intelligence, the attack of intelligence and information exchange. And when it comes to the consequences of war, and most of Chinese scholars discuss this issue from the consequences or implications on the overall international landscape and big power relations, and how this conflict have influenced the regional order. So basically, Chinese scholars believe that with this conflict, the eruption of the conflict, the landscape of international relations has forever changed. And now you have, once again, you have a divided EU and a divided Eastern Europe. And the power of the bilateral relations between Russia and the West will never recover to the relationship before the crisis. And when it comes to a bilateral relationship in China and the United States, and some Chinese scholars have the concern that the Taiwan issue might be Ukrainianized by the United States. And some literature discuss the implications for regional order. The regions such as the implications for the EU and the integration of the EU. And other scholars discuss how it would cause the instability of Eurasia. And some interesting analysis discuss the increasing competition of big powers in the Arctic region. And sorry, I'll just finally conclude here. So there are other literature discussing the consequences and implications for food security, international trade. Basic argument is that this conflict have done a lot of damage to international trade and world economy, and as well, and also energy cooperation. The research gap of the existing literature is that there haven't been sufficient discussion from the perspective of Ukraine, and the literature should pay more attention to the implications for international institutions. For instance, whether this conflict have uncovered the weakness of the UN again. And and I think now there should be more literature discussing the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, rather just than focusing on the big power relations. And sorry for and that's all for my presentation. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
So hello everyone. My name is Akira. I'm a PhD student at the University, and I studied both on the data science with China-Eurasia as well as Russian studies. Today I'm going to talk about combining technical analytics and political communication in social media to try and see what Russian people react to the war in Ukraine. In the study, I focus on the YouTube comments about Ukraine war because anonymous discussion in this platform are well suited to sensitive topics like one. And Russian people may not wish to be identified publicly, so I decided to analyze this platform. First, I searched the videos for keyword Ukraine in English.
Ukraine and China in English were filtering the results by highest view counts. And then I collected Russian comments posted on the 10 most viewed YouTube videos about Ukraine word. You can see here, this is the list of most watched videos in search results using keyword Ukraine and Vaina. Light green highlighted titles cover topics on how Ukraine war has changed daily life for Ukraine people or Russian people, especially videos of influencer or intellectuals talking about everyday life are very popular. Light blue highlighted videos ranked under the 11th cover topic on Ukraine-Russian politics, their relations and current affairs. The view count trend actually showed Russian users take a larger interest in thinking only daily life during the war instead of political affairs. To collect comments from these videos, I used the request module in Python. In data collecting, you often need to use APIs provided by social media platforms and lighter programming. The request module simplifies this process, enabling intermediate Python user to easily collect data in simple coding. From those 10 videos, I have collected about 300,000 comments. Traditionally, reading and undertaking massive comments has always been a difficult task, so I use the soft computing technique called text mining. In first stage, I'm going to use some co-occurrence analysis to visualize the topic of Russian comments. And then in stage 2, I have a sentimental analysis to really try and figure out what context influence on their comments. So what I'm trying to do is I'm using these two-step methodologies to really analyze the topic of massive comments, and then really figuring out what are the reaction Russian users actually show to discuss their behavior toward Ukraine war in particular. I think the approach is slightly better in that it combines data science with political science and then tries to reduce ideological biases in war and international conflict studies. So here's tools I am using. Quantita is a package in our library to text analysis for the social science research. Spacy is a free open source library for lexical tokenization supporting multiple languages. They are designed to handle non-Latin scripts such as Japanese or Russian, of course Chinese, in addition to European languages. On the first phase, let's quickly talk about the co-occurrence analysis to visualize the Russian comments. Co-occurrence analysis is a kind of network graphs connecting words that appear at the same time in the sentence with a line. The probability of words appear together is computed with Jaccard. The higher this value of Jaccard, higher the correlation between these words. The co-occurrence analysis makes the terms network graphs by computing the rate of correlation based on the Jaccard. You can see here light over on the right-hand side and left side on this network graph. That's what this method visualizes. You can see that on the right-hand side, human life-related words are displayed such as human, family, Christ, or time in Russia. And then right side, country and city name are displayed, such as USA, Kiev, West, or China. Say something that's obvious, but what may be a chance to look back on yourself. Obviously, you have more time to think about religion, family on your life. Once you know your life could be in danger during the war. But Russian users mention some foreign countries simultaneously, mentioning the life-related wars. You may not suppose thinking about foreign countries is equivalent to thinking about your life. And you may think Russian users are worried about their international relations with other countries after war started. And with that in mind, I want to focus on the country names appearing in the comments and make additional analysis to figure out in what context Russian user most likely to mention foreign countries. Phase 2, in my analysis in sentimental analysis using word embedding. Word embedding is a kind of natural language processing. Word embedding is capable of capturing words used in the similar context of the documents. So you can pick up some words with similar meaning by using word embedding. In the second step, I am using this method to figure out in which context each country is mentioned by Russian users. This time I used the library RSS provided by the Quantita to conduct word meaning in the sentimental analysis. The simplest thing I try to do is just classifying comments regarding each country into positive or negative groups because human emotion is frequently reflected in the social media comments. You can see here. This is the list of positive words and negative words in Russia. In this study, I assigned a number to the positive word and the negative word. This time, +1 to positive words, -1 to negative words. These numbers are called polarity score. If numeric value of a word's vector is close to +1, the word will be classified to positive group. And then the words whose vector is close to -1 classified to a negative group. Now, you might think that this way looks too simple, but this is very effective because a simple combination of words and numbers proving to be more sensitive method of classifying words into positive or negative. Before conducting sentimental analysis, I counted the number of comments where each country are mentioned to collect the comments by each country. You can see here, this is a part of list of country, ethnic groups, and capital cities and international organization in Russia. Asterisk at end of each word is a type of wildcard used in information processing. In analyzing European languages, you often need to handle case inflection. So asterisk at the ending of a word represents slightly changing of the word. For example, Japan is Iponia in Russia, but to Japan will be the Iponiu in Russian. So always the ending of the word changing. Too much or forms of inflectional ending, you can use asterisk when searching for Russian words in text. You can see the count results on the slide. Top 10 countries have been mentioned in over 1,000 comments. Russian user could see the top 10 countries as stakeholders in Ukraine war. Let's take a look at countries ranked below 11th. West Asian countries are more frequently mentioned than Eastern European countries, even though Eastern European countries faces the front line in Ukraine war and continue to provide military support. African countries, Brazil, Indonesia are rarely mentioned in the comments, even though Russia see the countries as good relationship partners. You can see here, this figure display outcome of classifying comments regarding US aid. You can see military and war-related words classified as negative class, such as strike attack, submarine, and ballistic missile. In comments regarding Germany, you can see Nazi-related words classified as negative, such as Nazi, Stefan Bandera, and Hitler. In comments regarding China, you can see economy and bilateral related words are classified as positive groups, such as cooperation, locomotive, and intimate. In comments related to to the USA, military words stands out as prominent topic. But in China-related comments, economic words appear in the positive context. It is very curious because traditionally, Russia see the USA and China as big stakeholders in Russia's national security policy and economy. Military and economic topics are valuable to further analyze into data sets of comments related to USA and China. I calculated the percentage of military and economic topics in each comments mentioning the USA and China using the number of likes in the YouTube. Because I think likes in YouTube can be reasonably considered indicators of resonance in social media discussion. I place class intervals of likes as follow: 1, 5, 5, 10, 10, 15, 50, 100, and 100 to 50, 100. Because number of likes follow the parallel distribution. And I wanted to display this curve line with long tail as a straight line. And then I counted how often comments appear in predefined intervals of number of likes. If these comments include words related to topics, economic or military, shown in LSS outcomes. You can see here the percentage change of two topics per class intervals represented in x-axis in USA comments. The percentage of military topics is 70% higher than economic topics in USA comments. And the military topic gets more likes than economic topic in most class intervals of likes, except for 50, 100. You can see here the percentage change of two topics in China comments. The volume of two topics, economic and military, is almost the same. But economic topics stands out as comments given most likes. So let's take a closer look at these outcomes. This time, it turns out Russian users associate themselves with connection with family or God when mentioning to the war in Ukraine. But they also mention specific names of strategic missile or military weapons in comments regarding the USA. So they seem more aggressive. I think behind this difference, they are likely to have some hostile feelings against USA. When, on the other hand, when it comes to China, Russian users are likely to hope to cooperate on economic and business areas with China rather than military assistances. And then, so far, I've been talking about topic changing in comments depends on which countries Russian user mentioned. And let me tell you quickly, I think this might look like the analysis results suggest the possibility to influence what people think about the war by changing the context in digital space and possibility to grasp what Russian user want or hope in the context of international relation with other countries. But I know that there are still many problems with this analytical structure in my study. One of the major problems is generalization. If you just switch the social media platform and use another data, the outcome might be just a difference or contrasting from this study's analysis results. I should try to analyze Russian social media such as Kontakte and Odnoklassniki in addition to American social media platforms. Next, where are Russian users from? Russian user or Russian-speaking users from Eastern Europe or Central Asia, ex-member of former Soviet Union. Of course, they might be Ukrainians. Now, in this study, I have just some hints or implication. Of course, I don't know for sure until I have analyzed this data again and again using more data. It also should be combined with insights of political science. Well, I want to say this study is just a first step of attempt to utilize the text mining in research on war in Ukraine. So with that, I'm going to review. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, now I want to invite Dr. Gevorg Melikyan, founder and director of the Armenian Institute for Resilience and Statecraft. Please, Dr. Melikyan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sahakyan. Thank you for this great opportunity to be here and to share my views about, as I think, an interesting topic, which is the cognitive warfare. Oh, I think we should be here. Okay. And yeah, it's very challenging and even compelling to be before this distinguished audience, especially when they are many students. So I welcome all of my students and all those who I am familiar with, and thank you, Dr. Sahakyan, for also not only providing this platform, but also trying to bridge new people. And thank you very much. So our brain is and will be the main battlefield in the 21st century in the context of the strategic competition between power centers, in other words, between superpowers, and also between local or small or medium powers. We are facing now global challenges in the world. During our previous presentations, our speakers were talking about the new multipolarity 2.0, or a new world order, which is underway of being shaped. And whatever is the consequences of this transformation, the warfare in general is unfortunately is still not over. After the World War II, and especially after the Cold War, we had hopes that the war will be something as a word that would be vanished from our literature, and liberal peace will be established. But unfortunately, we don't see that, and we see that even more wars are underway, and those wars are becoming invisible, and those wars are becoming even more challenging for us to counter. In general, I'm an IR student, IR scholar, focused on military alliances, theories of international relations, security studies, regional conflict management. But 5 years ago, I started to study non-kinetic ways of warfare, and also especially in the context of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and mainly after the 2020 brutal war launched by Azerbaijan against the peaceful population of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was not only accompanied by kinetic warfare and tools, but also by non-kinetic warfare, non-kinetic tools and instruments. In other words, I started to study hybrid warfare. And thank you to Dr. DNC, who mentioned about hybrid warfare, and also other speakers previously, yesterday and this morning, talking about strategic competition, big data, privacy, cybersecurity, and hegemonic multipolarity, strategic competition, strategic narratives. These are all part of hybrid warfare. So let's start from the beginning. Let's talk about the hybrid warfare, and then we will go to cognitive warfare, which is part of the hybrid warfare. My presentation will have 4 parts. First, I will be focused on the concept of peace and war, which is important for any IR scholar. Then I will be focused on the definition, short definition, goals and targets of the hybrid warfare. Then I will talk about the cognitive warfare per se and neuro weapons. And then I will come up with 6 policy recommendations for not only Armenia, but for many other governments who are facing this issue. The problem with the war is that in the 21st century, as I mentioned, we could hope that we are like people getting more civilization and becoming more modernized, maybe will not resort to war to solve their problems. A problem or a conflict is a common thing. We can all have problems. We can all have differences in our perceptions and understandings. But when the conflict or the competition become a war, there we have a big problem. So it's not something new. The international relation was mostly focused on the concept of war and peace. So we can see that, the bad news is that we have 65 types of war identified so far, but only 1 type of peace. And, and the scholar research and academia is more focused, unfortunately. It's not because of their fault, but because we have more wars, and we are more focused on warfare rather than on peace. But it's because we have what we call this tiny line between war and peace, because we don't know when the war now ends and when the peace starts. Basically, we're talking about a situation, an environment, a security environment, when the war, as it was before, never stops. But it takes different types, different transformations, different images. That's why now the world is becoming more and more dangerous, because you never understand when the danger comes from. I mean, we do understand, but it's very difficult to counter. So that's why why I'm talking about this, just to bring this information, this knowledge, and to think all together how we have to counter these new perspectives of new wars. You can see that the competition, if we use this graphic, we can see that we have 3 dimensions of interactions between nations. First, we have the cooperation. It's the great thing. We cooperate, everything is fine. Like, for example, Armenia is trying to bring a perspective for peace, offering this so-called Crossroad of Peace initiative, which is basically here, like on the first level. If we cooperate, everything will be fine. if we have communication and the roads open, everything will be okay, and we will raise the cost of war and lower the cost of peace, which is basically the first level. But unfortunately, not all nations and states agree on that, for many reasons. And they not only cooperate, but also compete in different things. We all talked about that. Now we have this competition between China and the US, between many other countries, as well as Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, if we're talking about our local issues. So, but this competition is still okay because it's below the threshold of the war. But we have a problem when it becomes an armed conflict, when they clash, when they kill each other, and it becomes a bloody war, bloody conflict, not just a conflict of interest, but a bloody conflict. And then we don't know how to stop it. Like, for example, in the case of Ukraine, in the case of Armenia as well, we don't know what are the perspectives of peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's still an ongoing process. So we have to be very careful not to allow all those conflicts become an armed conflict. But still, even if it's not an armed conflict is about kinetic warfare. Kinetic meaning the physical warfare. When people kill each other, they are using bombs, they are using jets, they are using ships, they are using everything that you know about, like soldiers, military, okay? But then we have, especially after with the globalization and the interconnectedness and all kind of, you know, interoperability and all things that are coming together, and we don't know where are the lines, where are the borders, and we have the gray zones. Gray zones meaning that it transcends all three levels and becomes a dominant dimension in warfare, meaning that every day we are basically in a gray zone, starting from cybersecurity or cyber warfare, going to informational warfare, psychological warfare, economic, and many others. So why is that? Because nations trying to gain control over another nation, they understand now that maybe it's better to use non-kinetic warfare, non-kinetic means, than kinetic means, because first of all, it's visible. When you kill someone or you trigger war, it's visible. When it's not visible, then you don't have any responsibility of that. So that's why now nations are trying to go invisible rather than stay visible. Okay, so that's why we are facing this kind of difficulties, because we don't see mostly. Some of times we see it, but this is the problem: how to detect them, how to counter them. Let's talk about hybrid wars. I'm sure that you know about that. I mean, you heard about that, but there are some confusions about hybrid warfare. Not because people don't know about them, but because mostly, for example, in the Armenian reality, when people talk about hybrid warfares, they mean mostly information war. They mean media literacy, they mean critical thinking, which are important things, but this is just only one small part of hybrid warfare. It's even larger, it's very big. Let's see how they are. I mean, hybrid warfare is a contemporary form of warfare that integrates conventional military tactics with non-conventional military tactics. And over time, they expanded their scope. And now they basically use all kinds of malign strategies that can undermine the adversary's strengths using their vulnerabilities. So hybrid warfare is against vulnerabilities of states, and they are many. For example, when we had COVID-19, it showcased how vulnerable is the healthcare system across almost all countries, even the most developed countries. So not talking about the cybersecurity, not talking about informational warfare, psychological, and many others that people are not even aware of. So that's why we call this, I mean, the terms that are used in literature, they are different, but I mean, for us to understand what we mean by saying hybrid warfare, you can meet different kind of words and terms like non-conventional, asymmetrical, irregular, non-kinetic, non-linear, surrogate, it's my favorite one, unlimited, and invisible. And it's invisible, okay? It's disguised, so you cannot see that. What are goals of hybrid warfare? There are many. I just mentioning a couple of them, or 6 of them. It's complete or partial disintegration of a state. Yeah, it's like a kinetic warfare, but without using any weapons. You want to disintegrate another country. I mean, those who are aware of Azerbaijan, I can't talk about Russia, but this time I want to talk about Azerbaijan, not Russia. Azerbaijan is using a wide range of hybrid warfare, hybrid tactics and tools against Armenia. And one of the aims of those strategies is to make in a way that Armenia becomes a failed state. Basically, you don't kill people, you don't attack with your tanks and jets, but you do a big harm to a country that you don't like. So they will attack vulnerable state institutions with low resilience. Resilience, it's a very buzzword nowadays, you know, resilience, which means what is the level of resistance of the country, of the nation, of the institutions, of state and non-state structures. If the resilience is very low, meaning that you are not aware of dangers or risks and challenges, you cannot counteract them. And that's why now we are working on them to build resilience, to make in a way that the Armenian society, for example, starting from education, going through media literacy, critical thinking, information, and other fields, be aware and to be ready for this new reality, which we call gray zone, meaning that there are no colors, but the war is still ongoing process. You can feel all the time. So they also will want to make in a way that you change your foreign policy or policies in general. For example, you can remember the couple of months ago, Armenian side was struggling with Azerbaijan over a small factory, you know, on the border, and that Azerbaijan is making a very big pressure on Armenian government to close the factory, which is inside of Armenian territory, but Azerbaijan was not happy with that. So what Armenia did, it surrendered, meaning that it changed its policy, meaning that Azerbaijan use of hybrid tactics worked out. It's a bad news. So it wants to have chaos, submission, and surrender. Okay, so this is all about hybrid warfare. The main targets of hybrid warfare are mostly whatever you know. It's all about military power, first of all, economic power, political, diplomatic, information and data you talked about, financial market, media. I can stop on all of them, like, you know, separately, but we don't have time. So just remember all that. I mean, just take notes about all these fields that are target of any hybrid warfare. Basically, we can see that everything is here. But the new thing is now added to that is the brain. Oh, sorry. Okay. So then we have what is the cognitive warfare? What is the weaponization of brain science? Let's see. When we talk about the cognitive warfare, we have to bear in the mind that the target is the human mind, human brain. We want to have control over that mind. We have to make in a way that it thinks in a way that we want to think. We want to gain control over their minds and to influence them in whatever way we can, starting from drugs, toxins, and also going to psychological, ideological stuff. So that's why the cognitive warfare, it includes psychology, social engineering, neurobiology, neurochemistry, linguistics, logic, and many other methods and tactics that can be used to have a psychological and other types of influence over our minds. So the main target of cognitive warfare, the human capital, human mind, as I said already. So every one of us is a target now. It's not just a state, but every one of us using a technology is a target, okay? So that's why we have 2 levels, individual level and societal or institutional level. So on the individual level, new weapons or weapons that are used against the brain can be kinetic or non-kinetic. There are many techniques, technology methods used to achieve any goal. And the main objective is to alter individuals' attitudes, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, behavior, psychological health, perceptions, feelings, everything. Now, for example, we are talking about the crisis, identity crisis in Armenia. Well, not many of us, maybe, but some scholars are talking about that, how Azerbaijan is trying to take us from our history and give us a new kind of background, saying, you know, we are all newcomers, all those lands have been always under Azerbaijani control. Armenians are just part of Albanian church. Armenians have never had any culture, any history. And you know, the problem is not that they are doing that. Let's say it's normal because it's war, but that people here are buying these ideas. And I heard from many Armenians that they say, now they are hesitating, they have some doubts. Maybe they are right, they say. Okay, like let's face our history. Let's be fair with our history. Okay, great. So neural weapons can be chemical, nerve gas, pharmaceutical, stimulants, as well as a lot of psychological tools. Yeah, I'm done. And on the societal level as well, it's against all kinds of institutions that are part of the structure that we call state or nation. This is the biases. We have about 190 biases that can be used as a weapon, because biases, and when we don't think in a way that we should, so the adversary can use all of them against us. And you can see the map of the cognitive warfare in general. As you can see, it's a sort of like a big universe with galaxies, black holes, and all kind of stuff. So it's very big domain. So if we go through all of them, it will take us hours and hours. I'm just, you know, just trying to give you general information. And well, I will, only 1 minute, I will not read all that stuff, but 6 policy recommendations to enhance. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So neuro shields, what we call the neuro shields, and how to get ready for neuro attacks. Legal aspects, it's very important. Anna Parzan knows about that, how we need a new frame of legal frame to counter all kinds of information flows and the information that we cannot control probably on Facebook, on Twitter, on other places, and kind of hate speech and propaganda and conspiracies and fake news and deep fake and many other things. We should invest in cybersecurity and information integrity. It's very important to go through educational and media literacy initiatives, as well as strategic communication and counter narratives. I didn't have time to talk about narratives, which are also one of the most important parts of the cognitive warfare, and of course, resilience building in state and non-state institutions, as well as international cooperation alliances, like also with China, although China is always accused for being a trigger for cognitive warfare against other countries, but still it doesn't matter. When they have an experience, we can share, I mean, we can get some knowledge from them as well. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Dr. Melikyan. And I'm honored to invite here Dr. Péter Kránitz from Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, please.
Thank you, Mher. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, I would like to first grab the opportunity to express my gratitude to Mher and all the organizing members. I'll be talking about Armenia's European integration and the concerns it raises, although there might be many people in this room who know more of these concerns, although I believe that my views could shed some potentially toning light on an indeed complex context. When it comes to EU integration, we can distinguish economic and political integration. Both are already underway in Armenia since the comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement entered into force in 2021. I'm certain that the Armenian administration has the will to carry out extensive reforms in the economy, taxation, governance, and more. This has been highlighted by the Interior Ministry's collaboration with Lithuania with regards to police reforms recently. I'm also positive that the Armenian economy and human resources have a lot to offer to Europe and Europe to Armenia. The visa liberalization scheme with the EU is a step forward Armenia's connectivity and closer relations with the European family. However, at this point, I will break with the sensation that many of yesterday's keynote speakers shared about the prospects of multilateralism, multipolarity, interconnectivity, the age of frenemies, conflict management, and so on. And I will join Baron Melikyan on this. What I see is overlapping, contesting, and even contradicting contradicting multilateral platforms utilized for the sake of power struggle between existing and emerging great powers. The key players of the game of global geopolitics keep debating over the very rules of the game they are playing. And in the meantime, middle powers like Turkey grab as much positions as possible at the expense of smaller and weaker players. What do we see when we look at conflict resolution in the past years? We see war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, war in Artsakh, a potential war in Kosovo, a clash over sea borders and under the surface of the waters, a new space race, an uncontrolled technological revolution and competition, and deepening cybersecurity challenges, climate crisis. So, and of course, last but not least, the contest between China and the US, and what Graham Allison described as the Thucydides trap, which could potentially result in a great war. What are the consequences of this clash over the new world order for the small countries, the landlocked, the isolated countries, such as Hungary or Armenia? Is connectivity really the solution? Diverse partnerships indeed promise diverse set of tools to, in the face of emerging challenges. However, this transitional period of deglobalization or reglobalization lacks something of a paramount interest. And that is the set of shared and recognized rules of interaction, of war, of conflict resolution. Like between Ukraine and Russia, both accuse each other of aggression, white phosphorus and cluster bombs usage, ethnic cleansing, or even genocide. Who will be to judge, to decide who is wrong and who is right? The same goes for Israel and Hamas. Who will say whom to blame? I'm afraid that this transitional period will be that of resolving conflicts with means of military force and the deterioration of international principles and law. And this is where we turn our heads to Armenia and the EU integration. In this current turbulent geopolitical situation, security must be the first and foremost aspect of Armenia's foreign policy, both in terms of politics and economy, defense and energy. For such a landlocked country, connectivity is simply not enough. It needs strong and reliable alliances based on shared interests and/or values to be able to be resilient to existential threats. One of the principal theses of my presentation is that Armenia's further European integration poses serious security risks to Armenia. As yesterday, Dr. Janardan duly noted, economic deals result in stronger diplomatic ties, and the combination of the two leads to joint security dynamics. The path leading Armenia to European markets, institutional and legal frameworks, I argue, would inevitably lead to further deterioration or even dissolution of some of Armenia's existing structures of international economic and political ties of major importance. The European Customs Union, for example, excludes economies inside the Eurasian Customs Union. Should Armenia exit the latter, it would lose key positions in her largest export and import market. One key area is energy. Similar concerns go to Armenia's security architecture. Now I'm aware of the Armenian administration's stance that the CSTO and Russian-Armenian bilateral agreements and arrangements are practically irrelevant today, as they did not meet their expectations over the years. But the matter of fact is that de jure, they are still in force, and the withdrawal would mean an unpredictable gray zone for Armenia. No European country can provide enough weapons and munition to Armenia to face off the Azerbaijani and potentially combined Turkish forces should it come to an all-out war in the region. EU countries have been supplying the Ukrainian army for 1.5 years, and they seem to run out of ammo. They pledged to provide Ukraine with 1 million rounds by next March, and only 30% has been so far reached. And Ukraine is on the very border of the EU. It will be always prioritized over Armenia. There is no European state today that would risk a direct military involvement in the South Caucasus, not just Armenia, but Georgia. There were 2 times in history, in fact, that a European power, other than Russia or the Byzantine Empire, was able to carry out maneuvers in the region. The first was the British as an aftershock of the First World War, which led actually to the first secession of Artsakh, Syunik and Nakhichevan to the Azerbaijani authorities. The second was the Third Reich during the Second World War, when the Wehrmacht reached South Ossetia for a brief period. In the multipolar or emerging new world order of the 21st century, there are new emerging powers such as China and India. European states are at most middle powers within the US-led coalition. When united, however, Europe can still have a voice that is heard globally. Now, the EU is not a defense cooperation. The security architecture of Europe was established within NATO, and NATO is allied with Turkey and Turkey with Azerbaijan. The Ukrainian war, however, shifted the mindset of European decision makers. It was a slap on the face that might have awakened something that has been asleep for a long time under the warm and cozy blanket of American promises of security. The war in Ukraine testified how insecure Europe really is, which is especially risky in times of global power struggle between emerging and contesting superpowers. European leaders seem to rouse and attempt to strengthen their own and united positions in this contest. The concept of strategic autonomy, that it has been on the agenda for a long time, but only emerged as a practice in the current European Commission, has several pillars, one of which is enlargement. Europe attempts to expand in order to prevent other powers expanding at its own expense. The EU claims a key role in geopolitics, if not on a global scale, but on a regional one. And other than the Balkans and Eastern Europe, it is the South Caucasus where it feels like it's still in the game. The common security and defense policy aims at securing European interests by strengthening military capabilities, intelligence and peacekeeping operations, and cooperation among member states and with strategically important partners. Armenia could ride this tide and position itself as an outpost of European security architecture. Accession or even candidate status is not easy to come by. You can see it in neighboring Georgia. Let's hope next week they will receive the promised status, and it would be separated from other countries' candidacy. As far as a strictly hypothetical Armenian accession and the related reforms package goes, it would take at least a decade, but is expectedly even more to accomplish EU standards in judiciary, public procurement, financial control, taxation, competition and company law, trans-European networks, and especially agriculture and rural development. Among all the candidate countries of the Western Balkans and Eastern neighborhood, it is today Ukraine that moves in the fastest pace in terms of carrying out these reforms. But even in this accelerated pace, it would take at least 15 years to accomplish compliance with the EU law and standards. But if we look at Georgia's accession path as another example, major potential obstacles can be identified for Armenia too. The EU expects the depolarization of Georgia's politics from the ruling party. What would such a request mean for Armenia and the civil contract? What would the civil contract party do to depolarize Armenian politics? It's conceptually not easy to understand. Another request to Georgia from the EU is the oligarchization. The very framing of this request is Eurocentric and inconsistent with the economic realities in Georgia and Armenia. If you look at the Georgian ruling party, the gray eminence of the party, the founder, is one of the largest oligarchs. What would the ruling party do to de-oligarchize Georgia? Nevertheless, let's suppose that Armenia would be a forerunner in pro-European reforms. Even the premise of an accession agreement would inevitably result in either Russia or the EU initiating Armenia's exit from the CSTO. Defensive security measures need to be taken. Staying on track with the hypothetical EU-Armenian alignment, one may identify several arrangements that could be implemented. First, the EU's monitoring mission could be further extended. The expansion has already been decided, but its limits have not. More European representatives mean slightly more secure lines of contact. Second, the European Defense Agency offer administrative arrangements with third parties, such as Ukraine. It could do the same with Armenia. The European Defense Fund then could be one source of financing body for Armenian defense capabilities. Third, the European Peace Facility has over 5.7 billion euros in financial ceiling for the upcoming years. Although it will be certainly focused on Ukraine, it might also open up for Armenia. Fourth, I should note the European Council on Foreign Relations recommendation for the EU to collaborate with India and other third-party weapons suppliers to sell arms to Armenia on European paychecks. And then there is one last way the EU could further support Armenia's security. There are currently 21 foreign missions of the EU in the frameworks of its external action plan, 20 civilian and 9 military. One civilian mission is here. It's strictly unarmed and mandated only to monitoring functions, but Armenia could probably lobby for a military mission, such as the EU military assistant mission in Ukraine, which is basically a training and consulting mission, but the know-how and expertise could be decisive on the long run. All these above, however, are time-consuming processes, and time is not on Armenia's side. And the EU is not best known for taking swift decisions either. The most important security arrangement for Armenia would therefore be a peace treaty with Azerbaijan. I would recommend Armenia not to push the mediation of the EU, but instead, should no other options remain, request the assistance of one EU member state, one that is acceptable for both parties. As for Armenia's energy security goes, I don't know how much time I have left, Mher. Nice, thanks. So as for the energy security, it is a strategically no less important aspect for Armenia. Not just in terms of economy and security, but in terms of European integration too. Armenia's industry and households are undeniably dependent on Russian hydrocarbons. If Armenia stays on track with the EU integration, it needs to make arrangement in this regard too, as the expenses of Russian gas could significantly increase and the gas flow could even be halted. The EU already pledged to provide significant sources to renew Armenia's energy mix, and France could potentially provide assistance in leveling up the Metamor plant. However, these are also decades-long investments and developments we are talking about. In the short term, there is no alternative to natural gas. However, the EU would not be fond of an Iranian-Armenian deal if we are staying inside this hypothetical Armenian-EU alignment. Independence from Russian energy could therefore also be achieved by a peace agreement, a hypothetically good peace agreement in which normalization of economic ties with Azerbaijan could be established and supply chain directly or via Georgia could be reestablished in terms of hydrocarbons for Armenia. I know it sounds science fiction right now, but this is turbulent times we are living. I would like to quote Thomas de Waal when I say that this is an existential moment for Armenia. It is up to the Armenian people to choose a path no other party can do it for them. To remain in a familiar but currently unstable environment, or take an unknown and therefore highly risky path. I think that Europe is in a compulsion to move, or Zugzwang, so to speak. If an Eastern neighborhood country decides to ally itself with Europe, the EU is in no position to turn its back. I'd like to, however, end my remarks with yet another historical analogy, which might shed some light on my personal impressions on the state of matter. After the First World War, the West, Britain and France in particular, made a promise to Armenia. It promised alliance, security, and integrity for the First Armenian Republic. It was solemnly and ceremoniously declared in the Treaty of Sèvres. Then, in the autumn of 1920, when Allied powers assembled in Geneva for the first assembly of the League of Nations, no, not a single power honored its promise, and Armenia was left alone in the crossfires of Kemalist Turkey and Bolshevik Russia. The Treaty of Alexandropol, today Gyumri, Dismembered the Armenian Republic, divided the Armenian nation again between the two key regional powers. This deterrent echoes over a century-long period. To be vigilant. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your cold shower. Thank you very much. Dear all, I will deliver several questions to our speaker, and now after I will open questions panel for everyone. I have question for our first speaker. Thank you very much for your very important speech and introducing us Georgia's case. And what do you think? What was the reason that Georgian government decided to sign strategic partnership with China? And in which way it will impact Georgia's relations with the EU, US, and Russia? Thank you. And I have another question for our second speaker. Thank you very much for introducing us Kazakhstani public opinion on China. You are working in the place and you are saying us first-hand information. Thank you once again. You have spoken about public, and what about governmental bodies? Are they trying to control or use narratives about China? What is their vision about Chinese rising economic, political, and security influence in their country and in Central Asia? So I will go forward, or you want to answer? I will go forward. And Dr. Cinsi, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And it is very interesting for me why Chinese scholars use conflict but not war for describing the situation. And what do you think? Is it direct conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or it is indirect war between the NATO and Russia for Ukraine, where Ukrainian and Russian people stood victims of geopolitical struggle between great powers in an era of multipolar world order 2.0. Thank you. And I enjoyed also the presentation of Mr. Akira. He used interesting methodologies, and actually I have no question, but I have one suggestion. Do you like Russian rock music? Russian rock music. So I think, yes, I think that next time you can also research, because there are some kind of different opinion between Russian rockers about peace, and you can maybe see the comments under the music, anti-war or pro-war, and next year maybe you will introduce it as well. Just comment. And my next question for our good friend, Dr. Melikyan, thank you very much. And unfortunately, we have not Azerbaijani scholar here. I hope that next year we will invite, we are always open. I hope we will have, but for just keeping balance, you have mentioned that Azerbaijan is using hybrid warfare against Armenia. What about Armenia? I know that Armenia also used this hybrid warfare and using this hybrid warfare, if I am mistaken, please just say, against Azerbaijan. Which kind of steps we and Azerbaijan, if we are speaking about peace and if we are real, we are not bluffing, what kind of steps both sides need to implement to have peace and stop this hybrid warfare which you introduced us? And my question also for Dr. Kránitz, thank you very much. I fully agree with you. I fully agree with you, Dr. Kránitz. And I think that Armenians have mental map many times, mental map problem. Many times me and Anna are discussing this. We are in this region, but we think that we are somewhere next to France or Luxembourg. It is not right. We are in this region, we need to find ways to live here, and we need to work with regional states. And of course, EU sounds good. We, not all of us, because Armenians are very different. Armenians, many Armenians, they share values of Europeans, many of them with Afghanistani values. I'm not joking, it is true. And we have many similarities with our Turkish neighbors, Iranian neighbors. Some, they share Russian values. Because we are in crossroads, we took many things. But of course, we are here. I totally agree with you. We need to understand. And thank you for your great knowledge of Armenian history. You have provided one example from our history. And unfortunately, it is happening again. And we have this lesson from history, but we are doing the same mistake. Please. Yes.
Some thought, thank you. I think the China Georgian deal, I think is pretty straightforward. It's about fulfilling this desire for a multi-vectoral, if that's the right phrase, foreign policy, about not choosing one power, not one grouping above the other. So I think this just fulfills this desire. But I think the time factor mattered as well. China could invest, be present, be there, launch large-scale strategic development projects a lot quicker than the Europeans. There are less red tape, less conditions from the Chinese side, which I think this is part of the explanation too, as to why the EU on the ground at least has been just so much slower than China to be there in Georgia and maybe in this country as well. I think that from a current perspective, the EU's concern is more about Russia, first and foremost. But I think the EU's concern is about China being the key investor in the country. And I think the EU and the US's concern, apart from infrastructure and investment, is the way in which China's strength, let's say, and presence in Georgia may be a hindering factor, stopping the country, improving its standards of democracy, improving its openness to civil society, accountability, inclusion, human rights, etc. I think that is also a preoccupation for the European Union, that it's a barrier to development. The Georgian dream and China get on like best friends. It's not the case with Brussels so much. Yes and no. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, the government's actually quite interesting in Kazakhstan because like many of the other middle power countries, they are very multi-vector and multilateral in their approaches. So that also is reflected in, particularly in studies looking at the state media. So the state media tends to be pro-China, but they're also pro-Russia, they're also pro-US, because Kazakhstan's like, everyone is welcome here. And they very much push that in terms of, and also within their idea of Kazakhstani, because the civil part. So the Kazakhstan government also has to approach the fact that they're like, we're a multi-vector, multilateral, but also multi-ethnic country, mixed with the fact that they also have very strong Kazakh nationalists. And like I said, it tends to be the Kazakh newspapers, the Kazakh media that tend to be the most anti-China, and these days also more anti-Russia than they used to be as well. That being said, it is not above the Kazakhstani government to use unhappiness with China to their advantage when it comes to negotiations. And they also don't completely suppress and are willing to let the people, when they have issues, sort of protest. That way they sort of get it out of their systems and Kazakhstan moves on as business as usual. But they do tend to promote the positive aspects, but they do that across all of their dealings with these different countries. They strike a nice balance, but on the sort of elite individual bilateral relationship, they all tend to be very positive and they work very hard on their diplomatic relations with China. And that is because they, of course, have all of these countries working. I mean, if you look at their biggest industries, they have the US, they have the Chinese, they have the Russians, they have the EU. So they're having to play this game every day of making sure their diplomatic relations with all these countries, and especially economically, have been very successful in creating a multi-vector economic approach.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your questions. So first, about the question why Chinese scholars tend not to use the term invasion to describe this Russian. Actually, words sometimes are used in Chinese narrative, but most in the media. Chinese scholars tend not to use the term war to describe this conflict. When there are explanations for this, I think the position of the Chinese government and most Chinese scholars is not to further exacerbate this conflict, because the Chinese government position has always been to find a peaceful means to solve this conflict. So I think that might explain why the term war is not used to describe this conflict. But I also want to elaborate on the term about invasion. I mean, if you use the word invasion, obviously you're holding the Russians responsible primarily for this conflict. I think you have to understand that there are a large group of Chinese scholars, especially those scholars who have conduct research about Russia and Eastern Europe. They tend to have such affections about Russia because, I mean, they have been studying this country. And for instance, scholars in the Institute of Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And this institute was founded in 1960s. So some scholars who study Russia tend to have this affection of Russia. So you can say they are pro-Russian scholars. So it is understandable they tend not to use the term invasion to describe this conflict. And about the second question, I do agree. I tend to align with some of my colleagues about the essence of this conflict, that Ukraine is caught in the crossfire between NATO, United States, NATO, and Russia. I mean, and I also tend to align myself with Professor John Mearsheimer's position or argument that NATO should be mainly blamed for this conflict. It was the reckless expansion that has caused this conflict. But I mean, from the Chinese perspective, the solution to this conflict, I mean, it seems that all the parties and the EU, NATO, United States, Ukraine herself, and Russia kind of should all be held responsible for this conflict. So the only way to, I think, to solve this issue, since there are violations of both sides of the Minsk agreements, and the only solution to this issue is can only depend on the willingness of the two parties, Ukraine and Russia, to find the willingness to sit down and search for a settlement. I hope that partly answered your question. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Dr. Sahakyan, thank you for your very tricky question. If I answer this in a way of saying that Armenia doesn't use hybrid warfare tools, you will say that I'm very biased. If I say that Armenia does, then you will say, I mean, I will think that it's a little bit far from the reality. The point is that Armenia should use the hybrid tactics against Azerbaijan, but it is not using, unfortunately. That's why we are pushing the government to be aware, like when we're increasing the capabilities of the military, then we have also to increase the capabilities of the non-kinetic environment. But let's be in this way, let's put in this way. Armenia, again, I mean, I was always someone who was pushing the government to be more proactive. You know, I worked for the administration of the president of Armenia for 4 years, and we have been interacting with the Armenian government, including those people who are now, I mean, they are still in the government. Many left, some others stayed there. I mean, we worked on every day, on regular basis, to push the Armenian government to be more proactive in foreign policy. A foreign policy which is proactive, not just active, but proactive, means having new tools and new strategies. That, in my opinion, Armenia is lacking now. So Armenia was always reactive, always reacting to what Azerbaijan is doing. And I don't think that Armenia is great in doing so. And I would not put any equal sign between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan was and still remain a country which triggers war, trigger conflicts, and if it's not hiding that, I mean, they are clearly saying about that. And including the hybrid warfare, which is another way of making a war against Armenia. So the second question, how we stop that? I mean, unfortunately, we cannot stop the hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is something like a competition. You can never stop it. I mean, the competition is always there. You are competing, you are trying to, even those countries who are in good relations, they still have some kind of hybrid warfare against each other because they want to, they cannot lose the entire control over another country that have been, they were facing problems previously maybe. So the question is that we cannot stop that war. We can decrease the intensity. It will depend if we sign a peace deal, which is very elusive, very non-possible, at least for now. Then we can talk about measures from both sides to restrain from this kind of warfare. But in my opinion, as I can see from the Azerbaijani strategies and what they are now building as a capacity around Armenia and even diaspora, they are going from a completely different direction. They are now trying, for example, to make a clear wall distinction between Armenians from Armenia and Armenians from diaspora, always using the narrative that, for example, the Armenians from diaspora, they are not pro-Armenian and they are not contributing to peace in the region. So, and some people thinking that way in Armenia as well. So my final point is that Armenia should have hybrid tactics and strategies, and they should develop new tools instead of just being aware when it becomes visible, when you see the impact. So you have to get ready to prevent them rather than to just respond to those attacks from the Azerbaijani side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Corner after, and please introduce yourself.
Yes, Connor Judges, Ashoka University. I have a question for the two papers over here focusing on Russia and Ukraine, because you guys are both working with discursive codes and things like this. And, you know, in the West, in our conception of the English language, Russia invaded Ukraine. There's no ambiguity about that. But from the Chinese perspective, you have different words. You have like 入侵, 侵略, you know, 夺, like annex, invade, all of these kind of nuances and variables that don't have an English equivalent. It's like when you go into a country and you steal something and then you leave. But what is happening in Ukraine is more of an annexation. And Russia has repeated this. It took Sakhalin at the end of the Second World War. It's invaded and annexed many other countries. So I'm wondering if you could incorporate this aspect into your research, how annexation is viewed in China. And the other point is I think that Chinese policymakers are maybe a bit disturbed because they invested so much into this main corridor, and Russia's unilateral actions have disrupted it. But I don't know how popular that narrative is in China or why it's being ignored. It's just a point of curiosity for me regarding both of your papers. So I appreciate your comments.
Okay, thank you. Chaoting Chen from Free University of Berlin, Germany. I have one question to Professor Jessica Lienfei. So I think your research is very interesting. You have also mentioned that China is actually very good at dealing with elites. So my observation in Germany is that actually China is not good at dealing with the public, including civil society and ordinary people. Actually, China has made a tremendous efforts to improve its image and the perception of people in other countries, but the outcome is not satisfying. So my observation is that China doesn't know how to deal with civil society. China doesn't know how to deal with criticisms. So this is my observation, especially in Germany. So any comments from your side?
Hello, this is Tuğba Eldem from Fenerbahçe University, Istanbul. I would like to thank all of you. So first questions with regards to Georgia's possible EU accession. How likely do you really see that, Georgia and maybe Moldova or Ukraine one day will become really a member of the EU? And what kind of a EU are you, if you think that it is possible? What kind of an EU do you foresee, like maybe in a structure that the President Macron was maybe telling, maybe it is a more likely scenario? And with regards to, this Armenian-Azerbaijan normalization efforts, on Thursday, I'm not an expert on the issue and I'm not very knowledgeable to, about it, but on Thursday, there was I think, important developments with regards that both Armenia and Azerbaijan agreed on a set of confidence building measures, such as releasing the war prisoners. So laying a groundwork for the normalization and hopefully maybe for the peace treaty. But I don't see, for example, nobody is talking about this. Is it for you in Armenia, these kind of things like the normal, so they do not have any importance? And how do you evaluate this development? And second, we are reading some reports, some analysis telling that like the current government in Armenia is looking favorably for at least they are aware of the economic benefits that the increasing connectivity will bring to Armenia. And also, being part of the middle corridor, for instance, would be very beneficial for Armenia. The government thinks like that, but there is ultra-nationalist circles in Armenia which are pressuring the government or constraining government's room of maneuverability. So what would you comment on that? I don't know, I'm asking to both of you, whoever wants to give an answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. It's about your question about how annexation is described in Chinese narratives. I have to be honest that we don't use the term annexation. So in my slide, I actually used the term that the peninsula was annexed by Russia, but I was hesitant whether to use that term. I just use that for the sake of parsimony. In Chinese narratives, we tend to describe this Crimea crisis as that there's a referendum, and it seems to be legal for Russia to respect results of that referendum. But I mean, for China, and I think our position as that Russia's security concerns should be addressed, and NATO and the West, they cannot ignore this insecurity of Russia, and that has been the major cause of this conflict. But I don't agree with you that China ignored this crisis. But I mean, I think China, the government also hopes that this conflict can be resolved by peaceful means, because we don't want to see further escalation of the conflict. It's bad for business, and it's bad for our economy, the recovery of our economy, especially after the pandemic. And it also it is a major threat to food security, not just to China, but to the security of all over the world. And thanks.
That's actually a really good question. And that's actually some of the stuff that are part of also the surveys that we're doing. So we wanted to find out more about the things that China has tried to do to reach out to Kazakh citizens. So for example, the China Daily is published in Kazakh, but most Kazakhstani citizens don't know that. So that was one of the things we asked. Actually, many of them found out through our survey that they could actually read the Chinese People's Daily in Kazakh. Also, another problem within that, though, is that when they do get on, is that they use a more archaic vocabulary than are used in Kazakh today. So they, a lot of the translators are Kazakh Chinese, and their Kazakh is different than what the local populations are using. And specifically, one of my students looked at it and went, "That sounds like something my grandmother would say." So that's something to connect, is realizing, is also maybe also talking to the local populations and getting their input in what's going on. A similar problem with the Health Silk Road. It was not advertised very well. And then again, I did a survey about that, and a lot of students and people found out about the Health Silk Road through this and the sort of Chinese work that was being done. It actually inspired one of my students to write a news op-ed about it. And what they found was that one of the problems came from it was that some of the Chinese health groups actually came in and then criticized the Kazakh hospitals, which didn't go over well. So it was sort of the sort of optics and the face-to-face interactions were not super positive. And that's one area where I think China can do the most work. Is I think the visa-free regime might help in getting more people-to-people connection, but also in encouraging the sort of industries that exist already in Kazakhstan, that they integrate their working groups more, that they don't keep so right now everything's very separate. So Chinese workers work here, Kazakh workers work here when they're working for the same groups. There's no integration in the same way you see with the other Turkic countries that work in Kazakhstan, or you even see with the Americans, or you see with the Europeans who work there, where you see more integration of the groups that are working there, working together. And so that creates again, that us versus them mentality that would probably be helpful to overcome by trying to get more integration, as well as working with the Chinese media news to promote Kazakhstan more positively. Sometimes that actually came out in COVID a couple of times, where Kazakhstan was used as sort of a prop, which irritated a lot of people because of their relationships with the US, and they were an easy country to sort of throw into the media in ways that didn't come off very well to the Kazakhs. So most notably was the couple articles that came out about, oh, the Chinese actually developed COVID in a in the Kazakhstan with the US military and the US CIA, and that optic, while it was a propaganda piece that didn't necessarily come from the Chinese government was then picked up by the Russians. And next thing you know, there's a lot of upset Kazakh people talking about it on Twitter and talking about it on Instagram. So it's thinking about those optics and also promoting like positive stories and also positive media within China, because they pick up on the Chinese media and blast it in Kazakhstan. And so whenever there's anything negative said, which tends to happen more often than positive, that tends to be a problem. So it would be if they, even small little things, the Kazakh nationalists really, really like when anything positive is said about Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan culture. And that's the kind of things that really resonate more to them, sometimes more than just an economic statement.
I think absolutely. I think we can envisage an EU enlargement to Georgia plus. Oh gosh, yeah.
No. Just.
Well, I think, yeah, we can talk after about Turkey. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I absolutely envisage, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine inside the EU for sure. If you look at how much they have approximation to the EU already, Moldova is streets ahead. Georgia is a very low third rate, I have to say, and Ukraine is somewhere in the middle. But of course, there are structural issues preventing the enlargement, not just the reform, the very fragile reforms in the three countries to do with democracy, but also there's also the Western Balkans countries. They've been queuing there quietly in some cases, not quietly in other cases. So they're joining a queue, and it feels unfair to shift the Western Balkans out to move these three countries in. And of course, all three countries in different ways have conflicts inside or next to their territories. And although the EU allowed Cyprus in, it's arguably quite a different case. So that's another structural issue. The EU has to adapt, of course it does. And we've been talking about multi-speed Europe for decades, facing an EU of 30 countries plus, of a wider variety of countries, big, small countries with conflicts, with less strong democracy. I think now is the time for a multi-speed Europe, if ever there was one. Turkey later.
Thank you for your question. It's a very complicated issue. So, and it has many layers and many dimensions, starting from emotional, going to rational. And it's not just that simplistic way of saying that, there are some groups of nationalist people. It's not like in Turkey. It's not like we have people who are opposing to whatever government is saying just because they are good and they are bad. Others, no. There are many layers, and I will just go through all those, some of them, because we don't have time. First of all, the release of the prisoners of wars is subscribed in the November 9, 2020 declaration. It's not something new. It happened before, so that's why it could not have such a big, reaction in Armenia, basically just because it is also in the context of September 13 or 19 ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh. So people cannot just rejoice by the fact that 30 people were released when we had like more than 100,000 people exiled from their homeland. So, but to be, precise, I'm part of the joint group of Azerbaijani and Armenian experts on confidence building measures, as I was part, by the way, of Armenia-Turkey normalization process, again, between Armenians and Turkish experts. And we release a statement welcoming that move. But it's very complicated, it's not just about that. So the fact about the crossroad of peace thing, first of all, Azerbaijan rejected that proposal by Armenia. It's not the Armenian ultra-nationalist people, but that we don't have such. Okay, so it's like they're just people who are concerned by their future. They want to have more clarity and certainty about what Armenia is doing, what Armenia is signing, where Armenia is heading to. It's not just like, there's a government saying about good proposals, and the Armenian civil society not understanding how good is it, and they are just rejected. No, first of all, Azerbaijan rejected that. They said that it's not feasible, and what they need, they call it the Zangitur corridor. They don't care about Armenia's connections with Turkey and Azerbaijan or Georgia and Iran. And then you have to ask also your government why the Turkish government is not opening the border with Armenia since '93. If that was like, if you think that it's good to have open borders, why then Turkey is not opening the borders to have an example to show that, to be a role model how Armenia-Azerbaijan relations should be. So it's very complicated, and I will stop here, but if you have questions, I am ready to answer. Thank you.
Let me also have some final remarks. First, I would like to thank Professor Erdem that she's here with us and raises concerns. It's very important to have the voice from the other side of the border. As you mentioned yesterday, the Zangezur corridor would be a non-stop, seamless communication between Nakhichevan and Azerbaijan. It would not benefit Armenia. It would further isolate Armenia and also Georgia, for that matter, because the middle corridor is already existing. The Zangezur corridor would make it slightly faster. It exists through Georgia, but if it would exist through Zangezur, then it would be a little bit faster, but it would not benefit Georgia and not benefit for certain Armenia. So the normalization scheme, the problem is that Armenian government accepted in 2020 November the Zangezur corridor on principle. So there are legal grounds for this to proceed, but this process of normalization should be very delicate and nuanced. Thank you.
It's a very simple question. Actually, Armenia is a republic that gave anything additional, but so we also for the benefit of our residents. We can reach each other. So we need to construct our relations on this common thing that we have together. And hopefully during next conference we will succeed. Thank you very much.